Ocean of Storms by Brief and Dreamy. Chapter 6. The halls rang with chatter and the movement of 1,000 students. Harry pushed through the crowd, moving as fast as he could, knowing he was already late enough to potions that Snape would take away hundreds of points. If he didn't get there before the end of class, Snape would ban him from playing Quidditch for the rest of the year and Slytherin would win the House Cup. Everyone else seemed to be traveling in the opposite direction, surging against him, preventing him from making any progress. "Hey, Harry," said Colin Creevey, blocking Harry's way. He lifted his camera and took a photo, blinding Harry with an explosion of light. "Don't do that," said Harry, rubbing his eyes. "I don't like when people look at me." "But you're important," said Colin. "We need photos for the history books." Harry tried to squeeze past Colin, but there wasn't any space. Colin took another photo. "Get out of the way," said Harry. He grabbed Colin's shoulder. Colin stiffened. A wave of gold blossomed in the spot where Harry touched him and spread down his chest, up his neck, until it covered his entire body. Harry jerked his hand away and watched in horror as Colin transformed into a golden statue. With echoing cracks, a series of fissures blossomed across Colin's surface. They deepened, crumbled, and Colin collapsed into a pile of rubble. "No," said Harry, breathless. "I didn't mean to." He spun around. There stood Remus, frowning and gaunt. "Help me." "I cannot, Harry," said Remus. "You have to." Harry tried to shake him, but the moment he made contact, Remus became golden and then shattered. "Harry," said Dumbledore, "listen to Professor Snape. He's the only one who knows the counter-curse." Harry tried to back away, but Dumbledore touched his face and Harry watched, horrified, as Dumbledore disintegrated. Harry hunched his shoulders and hugged himself, trying to avoid touching anyone else. The crowd surged, bumping into him, and each person who made contact turned to dust. Harry screamed and fell to the floor, curling into a ball, trying to make himself as small as possible. "There's no use whining about it, Potter," said Snape, looming tall above him. "It's your fate. It is going to happen whether you like it or not." Despite the fact that Harry didn't even touch him, the golden curse swept up Snape's robes, over his arms and head, until he too solidified, then splintered into pieces. "You're too powerful, Harry," said Hermione solemnly, her hands clasped at her waist. "Hermione, don't come near me!" Harry crawled away from her. The dust of the fallen coated his hands and knees, staining them gold, making them shimmer. Hermione shook her head. "It's too late," she said. "There's nothing I can do about it." She reached out, close again. Her fingers neared his forehead. "No," said Harry. "No, please, please." The dust rose, clouding his vision. He couldn't see her. He couldn't see at all. It swarmed up his nostrils, coated his tongue and throat until he couldn't breathe. He gasped, trying to draw in air, but there wasn't any. One of his feet smacked against a bedpost as he thrashed, sending a bolt of pain up his leg. He sucked in a breath. Then another. His duvet had twisted around his waist. His heart pounded. Another nightmare. He sat up, shivering, squinting through the blurred shadows. He knew there was no point in trying to get back to sleep with this much adrenaline racing through his system. He tied back the curtain and grabbed his glasses. Shrugging into his dressing gown, he put on his slippers, then shoved his wand into his pocket. The other boys remained asleep, he noticed with relief. He hadn't woken any of them this time. Shivering beneath his pajamas, he shuffled into the common room, aiming for the eternally flickering fire. Translucent, elusive images from the dream slid across his mind, prolonging the nightmare's sick ache. He thought about going to Ginny, but the possibility of finding Dean in her bed decided him against it. He reached his favorite wingback chair to find it already taken. Malfoy gazed up at him, bleary-eyed. Memories of the last time they'd met in the common room in the dark ether hours made his skin tingle, but he didn't act on it. The dream still occupied too much of his consciousness. "Potter," said Malfoy, his voice thin with fatigue. "Malfoy," said Harry, his own voice the same. Harry curled up in the second-best chair and watched the flames wave and snap. He drank in the heat. Malfoy stayed silent. It was the first time Harry had seen him since the party. He yawned, then stretched out his legs. He kicked off his slippers and flexed his feet in the warmth of the fire. "The chosen toes," said Malfoy. Harry snickered. He wasn't sure he had the wherewithal to deal with Malfoy, but he didn't want to go back to bed. It was curious that he so often ran into him awake in the middle of the night. He wondered if Malfoy had nightmares too, or maybe he was upset about Theo. The dark feeling of his dream surged upwards, heavy in his chest. "I'm sorry about Theo," he said. He rubbed his upper arms, still cold. "What do you have to be sorry about?" Malfoy pointed his wand at the fire, and the flames rose. "Well," said Harry, "it wouldn't have happened if not for me." Malfoy twisted in his chair to look at Harry. His bedmussed hair fell into his face, and he brushed it away. His hand clutched the wooden snake-shaped armrest, his fingernails bitten to the quick. Are you really trying to claim responsibility for what happened to Theo? Your ego is astonishing." Harry thought that was rich coming from Malfoy, but he was too tired to fight. He wouldn't have been in the forest if Ron and I hadn't convinced McGonagall to let us go out with the Aurors. "So you're saying that because Theo chose, of his own volition, to do something stupid, it's your fault Malfoy grimaced. "What happened to him was your fault, because you came up with this stupid idea in the first place?" Harry blinked at him, his eyelids heavy. "What?" "You have the manners of a troll. It's pardon, not what." Harry giggled. Sometimes that happened when he was extra tired. Malfoy glared, then continued. "Theo made his own choice. What happened to him is his own fault." "That how it is?" Harry kept his eyes locked on Malfoy's face so as not to let him stray to his left forearm. "Yes?" He shifted to face the fire again and crossed his legs. He wore monogrammed powder blue pajamas. His slipper, also monogrammed, dangled from his foot. Bony ankles. Harry had a strange moment of wanting to see what his feet were like. Weird to know what someone's bits looked like, but not their feet. He spent a few more minutes remembering Malfoy's bits. He rubbed his face. "The Aurors will find him. He'll be okay." He'd been repeating that to himself over and over again in the days since it happened. If they didn't find him, he'd been fighting the deep cellular need to get back in the forest and search himself. He knew it would only make things harder for the Aurors if he did, but it hurt like ignoring a virulent itch. Malfoy shrugged. "If you say so." "I do say so." Malfoy's expression didn't change. Harry raised his voice. "They'll find him." "Fine, Potter. They'll find him." Malfoy crossed his arms. His sleeves drew up, revealing the tail end of his mark. Once again, Harry marveled at the divide between this Malfoy, cold and arrogant, and the boy sobbing in his bedroom. When Malfoy yanked at his sleeve to cover the exposed part of his arm, Harry realized he'd been staring. Maybe it was because his half-asleep brain couldn't filter his mouth, or maybe it was because he needed to know. Harry said, "You don't still really believe in all that pureblood rubbish, do you?" By the slightest margin, Malfoy recoiled. Then he pursed his lips. "I'm not ashamed of who I am." "I don't mean that. I mean saying mudblood and thinking people like Hermione deserve to die. Do you still hold with all that? You don't, do you?" He ran his fingers through his hair. Malfoy followed the motion. Harry tried to smooth his hair back down again, knowing it was futile. Malfoy's gaze moved downwards and lingered on Harry's face. The corner of his mouth twitched. "If I say no, will you suck me off?" Harry exhaled a laugh. "I'm being serious." He tried to make his expression match his words, distracted by the little glow of he didn't know what in his center. It was always there now when Malfoy was around. A tingle of enjoyment, of anticipation. He bit his lip. With a sniff, Malfoy said, "Bearing our hearts to each other now, are we?" Malfoy wasn't going to answer the question. Harry didn't know why he'd thought he would. And Malfoy hadn't said no. He hadn't claimed that he'd reformed, changed his mind, and was planning to start a charity to fund school books for the Muggle-born. But neither had he insisted that, "Of course I haven't changed my mind, and you do well to see things my way, Potter, because they're accurate, and if being a bigot means believing in facts, then I'll happily admit to being a bigot." Merlin. Even when Malfoy wasn't talking, Harry could hear him inside his head. The memory of his sobs remained vivid, and Harry didn't think someone without regrets would sound that wounded. The nature of those regrets was unclear, but Malfoy had helped with the party. He'd invited everyone into Slytherin regardless of who they were. He wouldn't have done that if he still thought non-purebloods were untouchable. Or maybe Harry was telling himself that because he really wanted to suck Malfoy off. He slid off the chair and knelt at Malfoy's feet, the flames crackling behind him. The prickling heat of arousal had gone away towards clearing the clouds left by his nightmare. The firelight burnished the angles of half of Malfoy's face. He tilted his head. One cheek glowed warm and golden. The other receded into murky shadows. Harry touched his chin and moved it so Malfoy was all in the light again. "You still haven't told me if you scarred," he said. Malfoy wrinkled his nose. Harry fingered the top button of Malfoy's pajamas, mother of pearl. He undid it, then moved to the next one. Malfoy sat very still. Harry reached the final button, then spread Malfoy's pajamas open, exposing his chest. Malfoy's breath hitched. The darkness of the room outside their patch of firelight created the illusion that they were alone in the castle, just the two of them. Aside from their breathing, only the snap and rush of the flames broke the silence. It surrounded them, cocooning them in their patch of illumination. Harry drew his fingers down smooth skin and soft golden chest hair. He had to lean quite close to see the faint white lines, but they were there, the permanent marks he'd left. The smell of Malfoy's sleep-damp skin blended with the smoke of the fire. It curled through his mind like a potion. Starting at Malfoy's shoulder, he ran a fingertip across one of the silvery scars, angling down to his waist. Malfoy shivered. Harry looked up, thinking he'd apologize, but Malfoy's face was as blank as a piece of unused parchment. "You're occluding me," he said. He'd probably have kept his mouth shut if he hadn't have been half awake. "So?" said Malfoy. "Why? What are you hiding?" Malfoy's lip curled. "You always did like a good snoop, didn't you?" Irritated, Harry pinched him, wanting to force an expression. Malfoy gasped, then grabbed Harry's wrist to hold it still. His shields had fallen, and the intensity in his eyes made Harry go motionless. Malfoy's grip tightened. Harry's pulse thumped beneath his fingers. He tried to pinch with his left hand, but he only glanced Malfoy's skin before that wrist was caught as well. He jerked his arms, not so much because he wanted to get away, but more to see whether he could. Malfoy held him fast. Harry's heart sped up. Fever sparked and caught, melting away the cold. Malfoy took in his reaction and gave him one of his cold, cruel smiles. They weren't real. Harry knew that by now. Malfoy could be cruel, but he wasn't an essentially cruel person. No one who looked that sick while being forced to torture could be truly cruel. Malfoy'd probably copied the expressions from his father, like so many of his other mannerisms. That didn't lessen their effect. Harry breathed through his rising arousal, trying to keep control. He lowered his eyelids and gave Malfoy a look that said, "Yes, and?" Malfoy's smile widened, showing teeth. He made a sound in the back of his throat, then lunged, shoving Harry back onto the floor. Harry fought instinctually, but the weight of Malfoy's body on top of his defeated him. Malfoy pinned his wrists above his head and held him there. It happened so quickly that Harry's head spun. Before he could reorient himself, Malfoy had shoved a hand on the front of his pajamas and grabbed hold of him. Harry arched and yelped, his voice ringing through the empty room. He twisted, but even using only one hand, Malfoy was able to keep Harry from pulling free. The pressure on his wrists hurt, but the fist around his cock made that seem unimportant. Firelight reflected in his eyes. Malfoy leant close. "Shh, you'll wake them up." His breath puffed against Harry's face as he spoke in a low, silky voice. "You wouldn't want your Gryffindor mates to see you like this, would you, Potter? Held down and hard, beneath a Death Eater?" "Don't call yourself that," said Harry, shivering. "I don't like that." "Not sure I believe you." Malfoy gave Harry's cock a squeeze. Harry whimpered. "I like that. I like you. Just don't call—" He trailed off, realizing what he'd just said. "You're lying through your teeth, Potter," said Malfoy. There was something more in his eyes, but Harry couldn't identify what. "Yeah, well, I'm finding clear thinking a bit of a challenge at the moment." He lifted his hips, trying to change the subject and move things along. His fingers tingled with a lack of circulation. He took advantage of Malfoy's distraction to wrench his hands free and put them to use pulling down Malfoy's pajama bottoms. Malfoy hovered above him, bare from neck to hips, his cock wavering in the air. Harry squirmed. "Malfoy, if you don't get off me right now, I'm going to die. And you'll be known forever as the bloke who murdered Harry Potter. You don't want that, do you?" "Let me consider," said Malfoy, finally starting to move his hand. Slowly, so slowly. "I'd be famous. They'd put me in the history books. He who succeeded where the Dark Lord failed. If only he'd known that all it takes to kill the Chosen One is a slight case of blue balls." Harry laughed. "You're putting terrible images in my head." Malfoy smiled, eyes shining. "Here." Harry wrapped his hand around Malfoy's cock, making him hum with contentment. "Now it's fair." Harry tried to be quiet as they winked each other off. He really did not want to be caught. But Malfoy's hand felt so good that sounds escaped no matter how he tried to stifle them. Malfoy stayed silent until the end when he moaned as he came, decorating another one of Harry's old t-shirts. Harry followed a moment later, gasping and whining from the back of his throat. His skin alight, pleasure glowing in his core, Harry laughed. Malfoy's face shone damp and flushed, corn-silk hair in disarray, lips parted as he tried to catch his breath. Harry touched his jaw, drawn by a warm, swelling desire, by a feeling of gratitude for how good Malfoy made him feel, and for chasing away the nightmare. He leant up without thinking about it, and brushed his lips against Malfoy's. Malfoy had hot, sweet breath. Soft stubble tickled the tips of Harry's fingers. He flopped back down. Malfoy looked like he'd been petrified. Harry stiffened with embarrassment. Why had he done that? Stupid. A stupid thing to do. Malfoy stared at him like Harry didn't know what. "Sorry." Malfoy licked his lips like he was about to say something, then didn't. He cleared his throat, then in a shaky drawl he said, "No need to apologize. I'm well aware I'm irresistible." Harry grinned. He resisted the impulse to pull Malfoy down and kiss him again. It hadn't been that big a deal, really. Just an impulse. It didn't mean anything. Malfoy knew that. Prickling with sudden nervous energy, Harry grabbed Malfoy, rolled him onto his back, and held him down. Somehow that made him feel calmer. Malfoy didn't resist. He gazed up at Harry, occluding again. Harry said, "You never answered my question." "What question?" "Oh, right." Another nose wrinkle. "Salazar, let it go." "I know you don't," said Harry. "You don't still believe in that blood purity drivel." Malfoy shook his head, exasperated. "Then why are you interrogating me?" "I want to hear you say it." "Let me up, Potter," said Malfoy. "I've already had my way with you. You've no longer any leverage." "Your way with me," said Harry, and bit down hard on his lip to tamp down something uncomfortably close to affection. What was happening to him? Malfoy said these stupid, affected little things, and Harry went all funny. He rolled off Malfoy and climbed to his feet. He used his wand to clean his t-shirt and dressing gown, thinking that he was spending a little too much time covered in cum these days. Malfoy stood and buttoned his pajamas. Once they'd arranged themselves, they remained quiet, the atmosphere changing. Harry tied his dressing gown, feeling the chill again. He thought of his bed, and the dark feeling resurfaced. He ran his fingers through his hair, rubbing at his scalp. "Night, Malfoy." There was a strange, shaky look in Malfoy's eyes. He must be tired. "Night, Potter." Remembering, Harry held up his hand to stop Malfoy from leaving just yet. He took a second to make sure it would come out right. "I am sorry about the scars," he said, forcing himself to look Malfoy in the eye. "Honestly, I never wanted to hurt you like that." Harry thought Malfoy might scoff or make a sarcastic comment. He braced himself for it. But Malfoy only stared. Harry went back to his dorm, hoping he was tired enough to sleep, hoping he wouldn't have any more dreams. A pounding headache woke Harry just before noon. He'd missed breakfast. Ron hadn't tried to wake him. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. Remnants of what had happened during the night floated through his mind. That had been different. More than a quick and angry fumble. A shiver of anxiety fizzled up at the memory. He'd kissed Malfoy. He had to be careful. "Establish boundaries," Hermione would say. He wondered what else Hermione would say if she knew what he and Malfoy had been doing. He couldn't imagine she'd be enthusiastic about it. And Ron. Harry yanked on his jeans, then slid into a t-shirt. There's no way Ron would understand. Harry didn't understand it himself. There was a lot about it that made him feel ashamed. Letting Malfoy take control, doing what Malfoy told him to do. But it felt so good at the time, and he didn't want to ruin how good it felt. Relaxing in that particular way, allowing Malfoy to hold him down, to make all the decisions, felt freeing. It felt like he was accessing something deep at his core, some essential part of himself that he'd never before felt safe acknowledging. All he knew was that as soon as Malfoy touched him, the weight Harry carried from day to day, his guilt, the pressure of being the bloody boy who lived, it was just gone, just like that. And he became Harry, just Harry. But he'd never find the words to explain that to Ron. In many ways, it would have been so much easier if he'd stayed with Ginny. It would have been safe and comfortable. There was nothing safe or comfortable about Draco Malfoy, and nothing warm or caring. That was the point. It was sex, just sex, and that alone felt like a miracle. He'd gone so long without feeling good. Something hard and ravenous inside him wanted to hoard it, to snap at anyone who'd try to take it away. So he couldn't tell Ron and Hermione, which made him feel like a terrible friend, but there was no way he could see around it. It would be lunch in half an hour. He trudged through the common room, which was empty, and headed up until he reached the entrance hall. A group of Aurors huddled in the center. Harry hurried towards them. "Meyer's doing well," said Jimenez, before Harry had a chance to ask. "He'll be back in a week or two." A portion of the knot inside Harry's stomach relaxed. "Thanks. Anything new about Theo?" "Sorry, mate," she said. "Not yet. We're searching shifts night and day, and we won't stop until we find him." He nodded, shoving away questions regarding what might be left to find. "It was after me," he said. "The acromantula. It's the second time I've seen one acting strange like that. If he'd let it have him, then Theo would be safe. Are you sure there's nothing I can—" Jimenez cuffed him gently on the shoulder. "We're on it, Potter. Nothing you could do that we aren't already doing." Harry repeated that back to himself. There was nothing he could do that wasn't already being done. He still ached to get into the forest and look for himself. But he wouldn't. This time, he wouldn't. "You seen Weasley?" asked Jimenez. "You mean today?" She nodded. "He wasn't at breakfast. I wanted to check in, make sure he's all right. That boy does not like arachnids." Ron skipping breakfast was a bad sign. "I'll tell him you're looking for him," said Harry. Jimenez gave him a little salute, then turned her attention back to the other Aurors. Harry moved a few steps away, then lurked, scratching the back of his neck and looking at the ceiling as if he were standing there innocently, rather than trying to overhear what they were saying. People began arriving for lunch, though, and their footsteps and conversation drowned them out. Hermione descended the grand staircase, her expression inwardly focused. Her hair looked more tangled than usual. Harry waved to her, but she didn't notice. "Hey, Hermione," he called, and she looked up, startled. She had the huge, ancient library book under her arm. "Have you seen Ron?" asked Harry. She shook her head. "Well, where is he?" "I've been in the library all morning, but he's—" She gave a helpless shrug. "He's probably gone to see Fred again." She adjusted the book against her hip. It looked as though she were straining under its weight, so Harry took it from her. "Thanks." She gave him a tired smile. Harry examined the filigreed letters of the title, Historiarium Phasmagoria. How much time is he spending there? "A lot. I think he's scared that Fred will vanish if he doesn't keep him in sight." She tapped her chin. I need some potion supplies, and the prophet said that they've just reopened the ice cream parlor. We're going to go get Ron and use that as a lure to tempt him to come with us to Diagon Alley. Maybe the fresh air and change of scene will help." Harry nodded. Good idea. He liked the idea of getting out of the castle himself. There was a bit of scrum as they tried to go back into the dungeons. They had to squeeze by a large group from the Hufflepuff common room coming up the stairs as they made their way down. "You're going the wrong way," said Ginny, grinning. "We're going to get Ron," said Hermione. "You want to come to Diagon Alley?" "Nah," said Ginny. "I'm playing Catch the Snitch with Cho after lunch." "I'd like to come along," said Astoria, her voice soft and hesitant. "If that's all right with you, I need to visit the apothecary." Harry looked up. Malfoy, at Astoria's side, stopped short and ran a hand over his sleek hair. tense as a rabbit deciding whether or not it was in danger. The anxiety Harry had felt earlier when thinking about the previous night swirled upwards. Malfoy searched his face, asking a question. Harry answered it by frowning and looking away. "That would be lovely," said Hermione to Astoria. "Shall we meet you in the entrance hall in 10 minutes? Harry dared another glance. Malfoy had put on his imperious expression, chin in the air, face pinched. "Move aside, Potter. Your enormous ego is blocking the way, although where it stems from remains a mystery given you're about as prepossessing as a goblin's arsehole." "Draco!" said Astoria, and slapped him on the shoulder. So, they were already back to this. Harry spent several seconds trying not to picture what a goblin's arsehole might look like, then said, "Maybe try walking around us. I guess you haven't realized that the days when people moved aside to let a Malfoy pass are over." The curl of Malfoy's lip indicated that Harry'd struck home, but he felt no satisfaction. This was stupid. "For fuck's sake, I'll have you know," said Malfoy, pointing his finger, "that—" "Silencio." Malfoy's voice cut off, and Astoria put her wand back in her pocket. "Sorry, darling," she said, linking her arm through Malfoy's and dragging him up the stairs while he sputtered in silent outrage. "You're your own worst enemy, and I'm simply not in the mood today. You can have your voice back when you promise to use it responsibly." Rubbing at his temples, Harry glanced at Ginny. He thought she might say something sharp and funny about Malfoy that would make him laugh. She didn't. Instead, she stared at Harry with an expression that made him desperately wish he could obliviate the past seconds from her mind. As the others climbed the staircase, Ginny remained rooted to the spot. "Give me a second," Harry said to Hermione. She, think Merlin, had been too preoccupied to pick on whatever Ginny thought she'd noticed. Head lowered, Harry hugged the book to his chest. He wanted to lie, mostly, but Ginny wouldn't believe him. He gave it a half-arsed go anyway. "I haven't done anything. Malfoy's just being a git like usual." No response. He peeked at her. She gazed back, one eyebrow raised, hands on her hips. "The two of you were blatantly flirting during the party. I put it down to you being drunk, but the look he gave you just now? Something happened." Harry shrugged a shoulder. Did you? How?" "You want a detailed description?" "Bloody hell." She fell back against the wall and shook her head. "Malfoy, Harry? Of all people!" He lifted his knee and propped the book against it to make it weigh less. "It's nothing. Stupid. Just messing around." There. He'd admitted it. No going back now. Surprised by how good it felt to confess, he grinned. "Don't you grin at me," said Ginny. She stepped closer and peered at his face, eyes narrowed. His arms ached from holding the book. "I've got to put this down somewhere. Hermione'll kill me if I drop it." Ginny huffed and took the book from him. Harry hurried down the stairs, but Ginny followed him. "I'm just getting some gold," he told her. As they moved through the Slytherin common room, Ginny dropped the book onto a table. The sound of it landing echoed through the dungeon. Harry jumped and looked over his shoulder to see if Hermione had heard what was going on to tell him off. "Careful!" "I didn't mean to drop it like that." She followed him into the bedroom. Malfoy looked upset. Harry rummaged through his trunk and found a handful of coins, which he shoved into his pocket. He's always upset. "Did you knock him back?" "Ginny!" Harry bristled. "It's bloody Malfoy. Merlin knows what he was thinking." "What were you thinking?" He had to find Ron and Hermione. She'd leave him alone then. He hurried back through the common room and yanked open the stone door. "I did wonder," said Ginny, still on his heels. "Even when we were together, you were so focused on him, almost obsessed at times." Harry exploded. "I never thought about him that way when I was with you." He slapped his hand over his mouth. "No," said Ginny, softening. "I didn't mean it like that." "I'm not obsessed with him." He marched into the corridor and almost smashed into Ron. "Obsessed with who?" asked Ron. Hermione stood a yard away, looking quizzical. Harry slid his hand into his pocket, but then he remembered you couldn't apparate a way to avoid questions you didn't want to answer while inside Hogwarts. An irritating rule, really. Maybe he'd just stupefy himself. "With Dolohov," said Ginny. "Don't give him a hard time about it, then," said Ron. "It's fair enough. You should be more worried about him yourself. She wasn't giving me a hard time, said Harry. He marveled at Ginny's quickness with a lie. I just don't want him to get hurt, she said, eyes still fixed on Harry. Harry wondered if he'd ever get used to the staring. He doubted it. Hopefully, in time, people would stop finding him interesting. On a clear, sunny day like today, however, when Diagon Alley was crowded, Harry wished he'd thought to transfigure his appearance. He slouched and kept his head down, willing people to leave him be. For the most part, it kept them from approaching him, forcing him to paste on a smile and try to give them whatever it was they needed from him. Nothing stopped the stares, though. He could feel eyes watching. Someone whispered his name, making him twitch and reflexively look over. 2 witches outside the newly reopened ice cream parlor stopped talking as he spotted them. One of them waved. Harry lifted a hand in return. The other remained frozen, staring at him while her ice cream melted, dripping down the cone onto her hand. Ron's hand landed on Harry's shoulder. The price of fame. Witches can't take their eyes off you. We'll get ice cream later when it's less crowded. I want to visit Flourish and Blots, said Hermione. She gave Ron a pointed look. There's a book on spectrology I need. You never had a brother, said Ron. You don't understand. I understand that you're starting to look ill, said Hermione. This is the first time you've been outdoors in days. Harry cleared his throat loudly to remind them that they weren't alone. Are you interested in spectrology? Astoria asked Hermione. We've got several different ghosts haunting the manor in Surrey. They're primarily friendly, but Tobias gets very cranky during thunderstorms. That's because he died of being struck by lightning, said Daphne, who'd insisted on coming along when she heard her sister was going. You can't blame the poor man. Daphne has a bit of a crush on Tobias, said Astoria with an impish smile. A crush on a ghost, said Daphne. How ridiculous. Tobias is just a very good listener. You never admit when you have a crush, said Astoria. Even now, you. Harry tuned them out as they passed quality Quidditch supplies. A new broom called the Peregrine took pride of place in the display window. Its black varnished handle gleamed like polished marble. It had been ages since he'd played a proper game of Quidditch. He looked up at the clear, bright sky and wanted to be in it, feeling the air against his face. Looking for the snitch, watching out for bludgers, scheming ways to outsmart Malfoy. He missed that, beating Malfoy to the snitch. The image of Malfoy's face, hair fluttering, eyes focused and challenging, settled in his mind. The muscles of Malfoy's forearms flexing as he steered, his thighs tense as they gripped his broomstick. It's beautiful, isn't it? Said Ron, his voice soft with awe. Harry jumped, then jerked his mind back into the present. The broom. Ron was talking about the broom. Yeah, and I need a new one. He'd lost the firebolt during the flight from the Dursleys. If you two are going to stand there drooling over Quidditch supplies, I'm off to Flourish and Blots, said Hermione. Me too, said Astoria. We're going to the apothecary first, said Daphne. If Mother knew you'd let yourself run out of your potions, she'd make you come straight home. They make me woozy, said Astoria, and I've been perfectly fine. Only because the effects haven't worn off yet. First potions, then books. Don't argue with me. Well, all right then, if only you stop nagging. She turned to Hermione. I'll see you in the bookshop in 5 minutes. Why does she need potions? Asked Ron, once the sisters were out of earshot. What potions? Don't tell anyone, said Hermione. But she's got a blood malady, from an old family curse apparently, but she doesn't like people feeling sorry for her. Kinda hard not to feel bad, said Ron, echoing Harry's thoughts. She's so nice. You'd never guess she was a Slytherin. Just keep it to yourself, said Hermione. Ron nodded, then straightened up. You gonna get that broom or what, Harry? Shopping finished, they had lunch, then got ice cream and strolled down the alley. Harry itched to return to Hogwarts and try out his new Peregrine. He wondered if he'd be able to lure Malfoy out for a game, or if Malfoy would still be cross. As they passed Gringotts, a dark-haired girl swished down the steps, wearing silk robes and a gold necklace that gleamed in the sunshine. Daphne gasped and shrieked, "Pans! Pans!" She zipped across the road and threw herself at the girl. The The girl returned her shriek and hug. They kissed each other's cheeks. Said Hermione. I thought the Parkinsons moved to France. They did, said Astoria. They bought a chateau in Côte d'Azur. Her father helped fund property protectors and made a fortune. Property protectors? Asked Harry. You know, they'd send people to your house to set up protective charms and devices. Everyone used them during the war. I read about that, said Hermione. It's fascinating how certain people will always find a way to turn tragedy to their own benefit. Daddy's a partner in the company, said Astoria. Oh, said Hermione, looking flustered. Well, it's all right, said Astoria. He has very different ideas than I do these days. Her eyes widened. Oh no, what's Daphne doing? Daphne led Pansy towards them, their heads bent together as they chatted. Ron and Hermione were suddenly standing on either side of Harry. Hermione had drawn her wand. As if she'd sensed the change in tension, Pansy looked up. She went pale. For a long moment they stared at each other. Story, look who I found, said Daphne, oblivious. When no one responded, she frowned. Pansy angled her chin towards them. She fingered her gold necklace and smiled, shaking her shiny hair. If it isn't the heroic trio themselves. Forgive me, I'm all aflutter. It's not every day you get to rub shoulders with celebrities. Don't ask for an autograph, said Ron. We wouldn't waste the ink on you. Daphne's eyes widened. That was very rude. Astoria grabbed her sister's arm, whispering furiously. I don't think that's fair at all, said Daphne. She jerked her arm away and moved to stand next to Pansy. Let's go, said Harry. Let's just go. He didn't want this. He had no interest in it. Parkinson's eyes focused on Harry, glimmering with dislike. No. Harry knew what dislike looked like. He saw it on Malfoy's face every day. This was pure, icy hate. He resisted the instinct to recoil and stared back. He didn't say anything, just met her gaze until she blinked and looked away. I'll never understand what Draco saw in you, she said. You're ugly as an irrempent. Harry ran over her words a couple times in his head. Oh dear, Potter, she went on. You didn't know? Salazar, you really are as oblivious as people say. Shut up, Pansy, said Astoria. Harry shook himself, then turned and strode off, holding tight to his broom. Hermione hurried after him, while Ron took a moment to shout, Get back to France, Parkinson. No one wants you here. They paused outside the back of the leaky cauldron. Well, that was unpleasant, said Hermione. She was never a nice girl, but I suppose she's bitter now. Harry leant against the brick wall, trying to regain his equilibrium. She's bitter, said Ron. None of her family died, and her dad made a fortune. They were basically exiled, though, socially speaking. There were several articles in the Prophet about her father being a war profiteer, and of course, they mentioned what she did during the battle. You make your own bed, said Ron. That's what I say. Hermione sighed, and Ron slid an arm around her shoulders. Harry picked at a stray bit of spello tape on the package holding his peregrine. Oi, said Ron, grinning. What do you reckon she meant about Malfoy? He put on a high voice. I'll never understand what Draco saw in you. You think Malfoy fancied you, Harry? It would explain a lot. Don't be ridiculous, Ron, said Hermione. Who knows what she meant? I don't, said Harry, still looking down at the bit of tape. I haven't got the foggiest idea. What was Malfoy up to? One particular Gryffindor, and if you want someone to like you, and now I'll never understand what Draco saw in you. Once they'd returned to Hogwarts, Harry bribed Ron to join him on the Quidditch pitch instead of returning to the dungeon by letting him have the first ride on the peregrine. He shielded his eyes from the sun and watched his friend zip across the sky. Ginny whooped and did a spin on her broom. The peregrine was fast. Bloody fast. Draco hated Harry. He'd always hated Harry. Ron performed a mid-air turn that shouldn't have been possible according to the laws of physics. Cho applauded. Harry paced, running his hands through his hair. I get next go, shouted Ginny. It's my broom, Harry shouted back. I'm next. If Malfoy wanted Harry to like him, it didn't mean that he liked Harry in return. He didn't like Harry. He'd said so. He'd demonstrated so. They had An arrangement. That was all. He probably wanted Harry to like him so he could use it against him. And who knew what pansy had meant? Malfoy had called Harry unprepossessing just that morning. And yet, whatever was going on between them, Malfoy had started it. The arrangement had been his idea. He'd wanted Harry. Heat prickled over Harry's face. If this went beyond just sex for Malfoy, and Harry felt a strange kind of embarrassment even considering that idea, then the whole thing was more complicated than he'd realized. With a thump, Ron landed, windswept and breathless, grinning from ear to ear. It was such a relief to see him looking happy that Harry punched him on the shoulder. Ron staggered a bit, laughing, and held the broom out. "Get yourself up there, Harry. It's a bloody miracle. I swear it reads thoughts. I didn't even have to steer. It just went where I wanted it to go." "Wicked," said Harry. He grabbed the broom, jumped right on, and zipped upwards. Before he'd even had a chance to adjust to being airborne, he was high above the pitch. He leveled out, catching his breath, then shook his hair out of his eyes. He shifted left, then right, testing how the broom moved. Ron was right. It seemed to respond to your desires alone, but Harry reckoned it was just super sensitive to movement. "Come on, Harry," called Ginny, waving a snitch in her hand. She released it. It hovered in midair, swept to the right, dove down a foot, then it was off, moving too quickly to follow. Smiling, Harry tightened his hold on his broom, bent forwards, and flew. Chasing the snitch provided a specific sort of bliss. It took all Harry's concentration, and that, in combination with the rush of flight, made everything else fall away. He could live up here with the wind and the sun. Hogwarts Castle, the mountains behind it, the forest, the lake, all of it spread out in a panorama around him. The castle looked whole from the distance, undamaged. He made a figure 8 over the pitch, keeping his eyes peeled. You'd think that the lack of beaters and bludgers zooming by would make it easier to spot the snitch, but somehow it didn't. Ginny stared upwards. Cho flew in concentric loops. Harry searched for a flash of gold. Instead, he spotted Malfoy's shiny head bobbing in the distance. He was climbing the hill away from the lake, was heading towards the castle. He'd have to pass the pitch on his way. Just at that point where Harry's mind had begun to wander again, he spotted the snitch. There, hovering close to the ground. Slowly, so as not to draw the girl's attention with the movement, he raised his head. Neither of them had noticed the snitch. His broom had already angled downwards. He let it descend, making his posture and expression casual. No big deal, just going a bit lower. Something flashed across the side of his vision. Ginny, and Harry dove. The snitch danced inches from the ground. Harry could land and then try to snatch it, but he'd lose seconds, and Ginny might get it first. If he didn't, he'd risk crashing, and crashing hard. The peregrine zipped downward as if it already knew Harry's decision. Harry held on tight and gave in, wind battering his face, whipping through his t-shirt. He wanted the snitch. He'd have it. Fuck the risk. His broom gave him the edge he needed. As the green pitch flew towards him, he stretched out his hand, focused on his goal. Only once warm metal hit his palm did he pull up, and then skidded wildly through the grass and mud before coming to a stop. Ginny thudded to the ground beside him, cursing like a sailor. Harry grinned. His t-shirt had ripped, and he'd scraped the hell out of his arm, but it was worth it. He'd sat up, spit out a clump of weeds, and held the snitch aloft, whooping in triumph. Someone clapped. "Bravo, Potter. Graceful as always. Keep that up and you'll put the groundskeeper out of a job." Malfoy didn't stop walking. He continued along the path, his movements stiff and intentional. Harry stumbled to his feet, wincing as his leg complained. He could tell he was going to have a lovely bruise. Malfoy's hair gleamed as bright as the snitch. "Malfoy!" "What?" Malfoy snapped. Harry wasn't sure why he'd called out to him. "It's not what, it's pardon. Didn't your parents teach you any manners?" Malfoy pursed his lips so hard they went white. Harry could tell he was preventing himself from showing amusement. He rolled his eyes. "Right. So what do you want? I've got work to do. You've left me to finish the mirrors on my own." Harry'd forgotten about the mirrors. He could feel Ginny's interest, her eyes on them, without even looking at her. Cho landed a yard away. "Good catch, Harry." "Thanks." Harry shifted his broom from one shoulder to the other. He rubbed dirt off the side of his face. "Is that the peregrine?" said Malfoy, as if he couldn't help himself. "Yep," said Harry. Malfoy sniffed. "It looks sturdy enough. I'm getting the special edition, of course. They're only making 13, but Father knows the manufacturer, so he reserved one for me. It has actual peregrine falcon feathers woven into the bristles, charmed with agility and locomotion spells that Harry'll still outfly you, said Ginny. You can't buy talent. You certainly can't, said Draco. How old is that nimbus you're using? A good flyer will excel on any broom, said Cho. While even the best quality broom won't do any good if you haven't the skills. Malfoy's got skills, said Harry. Malfoy's eyebrows shot up. Ginny bit her lip. Cho blinked. Harry looked from one to the other, realizing what they all had in common. Maybe he had some kind of subconscious seeker fetish. Have I? Asked Malfoy, his voice low. Tell me about my skills, Potter. I'm just saying you know your way around a broomstick is all, said Harry. Drawn by the glint of heat in Malfoy's eyes, he took a step towards him, then remembered they were being watched and halted. Ginny covered her mouth with her hand. Wait until my peregrine arrives, said Malfoy. I'll show you exactly what I can do with a broomstick. Are they fighting? Cho, looking bemused, asked Ginny. Merlin knows what they're doing, Ginny replied. Malfoy pointed at Ginny. Keep your nose out. Don't talk to her like that, said Harry. Malfoy bared his teeth. What do you want, Potter? The breeze ruffled Malfoy's hair. His fire slowly dimmed. What do you want? The barely discernible quiver in Malfoy's voice sent Harry's nerves swirling like a cyclone. He crossed his arms. What do you want? He asked. Meeting Malfoy's eyes was agonizing, but he did it. Malfoy turned away. He chewed on his lip for a moment, then said, I want a life without you in it. Something cold settled in Harry's stomach. That's so. Malfoy didn't look at him again. Have fun playing with your broom, he said, then marched off toward the castle. Ginny reached for Harry's arm, but he jerked away. Cho looked baffled. I'm going to go take a shower, said Harry. He took the long way, crossing by the lake, so he and Malfoy would be less likely to meet up again in the common room. It wasn't until he was back in the castle that he realized Ron had disappeared while he was still in the air. As Meyer was still in St. Mungo's, and he suspected Malfoy would hex him if he set foot in the bathroom, Harry spent the next few days working with Seamus in Ravenclaw Tower. An intimidatingly large pile of stones filled a third of the common room, divided into those that were broken and those that had been repaired. Every now and then, a couple of professional builders would enter and levitate a group of them away. The volunteers, who included Ernie Macmillan, Justin Finch-Fletchley, Malcolm Baddock, and Millicent Bulstrode, were tasked with repairing the cracked stones. Ernie seemed to have appointed himself the boss of the others. You're still leaving too much rubble behind, Malcolm. The stone won't be as strong and solid as it needs to be. You really need to concentrate, and it's a twirl at the end, not a loop. Thanks for the advice, said Malcolm cheerfully. You're a real inspiration. Ernie gave him a paternalistic nod and didn't notice that Malcolm had used a nonverbal spell to turn his hair pink. Harry met Seamus's eyes and snickered. I say, Harry, great to see you join us. You'll find it's rather good to get stuck in and really build something, said Justin, casting a spell that made the disparate pieces of cracked stone meld back together. He wore muggle clothes, the sleeves of his expensive-looking shirt rolled up past his elbows. One feels that one's really making a contribution. Harry realized he hadn't known where they'd been spending their days. He examined the group, which included several people whose names he didn't know. Where are the Ravenclaws? Anthony and Michael are helping repair damaged spellwork, said Ernie. Luna's looking after Hagrid's beasts. What about the other Slytherins? Asked Harry. I know Malfoy's working on broken mirrors. Astoria's working with Madame Pomfrey in the hospital wing, said Seamus, and Daphne's on fundraising, writing owls, getting on the flu. She's away with words, Daphne. Can't she do marvelous things with that tongue of hers? Millicent shot him a dirty look. I'm only saying, said Seamus with a grin. Don't get too hung up on her, said Millicent. Her father will mount your head on a plaque if he finds out. Isn't the risk part of the thrill? Millicent shrugged. Your funeral. After Seamus had taught him the necessary spells, Harry got to work on repairing broken stones. Justin was right. There was something deeply satisfying about helping to fix the castle in such a tangible way. The first day left him so tired by the end of it that he slept dreamless through the night for the first time in months. There were no further nighttime liaisons with Malfoy. If he and Malfoy were in the same room, Malfoy exuded icy hostility. That was a good thing. It had been getting complicated. For some reason, this didn't lessen his Malfoy-related anxiety, though. That only got worse. One morning at breakfast, he found himself staring at Malfoy, watching him as he ate scrambled eggs. Malfoy had perfect manners, of course. He made something as mundane as egg-eating look graceful. The way his jaw worked as he chewed made Harry's insides tighten. Malfoy's sharp, thin jaw, smooth and pale. His pink lips slipped over the tines of the fork. Malfoy paused, fork in mouth, and red bloomed in his cheeks. His eyes darted to Harry, then away again. Something smacked against the side of Harry's head. A bread roll. He looked up and saw Ginny's raised eyebrows across the table. He scowled at her. He wanted to get up and leave, but he couldn't due to the physical results of staring at Malfoy. He stabbed at his own eggs, then shoved a sausage into his mouth and chewed it aggressively. Once he could stand without embarrassing himself, he fled, intending to return to his dorm and get himself in a state where he could concentrate on working in the tower. Halfway down the stairs to the dungeon, Colin appeared, wringing his hands. He swished from Harry's left side to his right, making him dizzy. Harry pressed his hand against the cold stone wall to keep from tripping over. "Could you maybe pick a side, please, Colin? You're gonna make me fall down the stairs." "Oh, Harry," said Colin, "you should maybe, I don't know, I don't want to interfere, but Ron is pretty upset." "What?" Harry had been so distracted by Malfoy ignoring him that he hadn't even looked for Ron. Shame tightened on the back of his neck. "He's upset?" Colin nodded. "Fred went away." "Away? What, he's vanished?" "He flew away," said Colin. "They had a fight the other day, and after Ron left, Fred flew through the wall. We haven't seen him since." Harry covered his eyes with his hand and took a deep breath. "Okay, Colin, thanks." He hurried down the staircase, heading towards the ghost dungeon. He heard Ron before he saw him. His friend's voice echoed through the corridor. "If you hadn't interfered, he wouldn't have left, you greasy sod." Harry started to run. "Yeah," Ron continued as Harry skidded into the room. He stood shouting and red-faced while Snape, arms crossed, remained impassive. "I can say what I like, can't I? What are you gonna do? Give me detention? Take points?" Remus and Tonks stood to the side, arms around each other. They had the air of people who had tried to help and given it up as a lost cause. Some of the other ghosts, like Crabbe, watched with interest. Some had turned their backs, pointedly ignoring the scene. Colin whispered in Harry's ear, making him jump and shiver. Snape told Fred he was indulging Ron by letting him spend so much time down here that he was letting Ron wallow. And then Fred told Ron not to come back anymore. And Ron told Fred that he was being a bastard, just like when he was alive. And then Ron started crying. Then he left. And then Fred left. And now Ron's back, and he's really cross with Snape because... "I think I get it," said Harry. "Thanks, Colin." "No, Weasley," said Snape to Ron. "Unfortunately, I am no longer capable of wielding discipline. Only advice, which you stubbornly refuse to heed. Your constant visits have become a disturbance. Something had to be done." "It's none of your fucking business," Ron shouted back at him. "Ron," said Harry. He shot Snape a glare. "Come to collect him, have you, Potter?" said Snape. "Be quick about it, or shall I brace myself for yet more tiresome shouting?" Wild-eyed, Ron spotted Harry. His shoulders fell. "That utter prick," he said, gesturing towards Snape. "He chased Fred off. Fred's gone. I don't know where he—" "I know," said Harry. He took Ron's arm and led him away, resisting the impulse to give Snape a two-finger salute. "Colin told me what happened." They reached the wall, and Ron slid down it. He curled forwards, burying his face against his knees. Harry sat beside him and wrapped his arms around Ron's shoulders. Ron shuddered, crying silently. His pain spiked through Harry's heart. He tightened his grip. "I've been an idiot," said Ron. "I can't let him go. Ginny was right. I've just made everything worse." "He's your brother," said Harry. "It's not fair. I know I'm being a self-absorbed git. I'm not the only one." He glanced at Tonks and Remus, who were keeping respectfully to the other side of the room. Andromeda lost her husband, her daughter. Teddy lost his parents. Harry didn't want Ron to start talking about anyone Harry had lost. It doesn't matter. It's not a, competition. Ron lifted his head. He wiped his nose and face on his sleeve, then rested back against the wall. Merlin, I'm glad I didn't tell Mum. Or George. He shook his head. They sat silently for a moment. Then Harry spoke. You remember the Mirror of Erised? Yeah, Ron snorted. Imagine wanting to be head boy and Quidditch captain more than anything else. I saw my mum and dad, said Harry. Ron nodded. The third time I went to look at it, Dumbledore was there. I don't know if you remember, but he told me not to look for it again, that people had wasted away looking at it, and I reckon maybe this Fred is the same sort of thing. Ron let out a long breath. Okay, I get it. He got up to his feet, then extended his arm and helped Harry up. Thanks, mate. He wiped his eyes again. I'm going to find Hermione. Good idea. Ron patted Harry on the shoulder and trudged out of the room. Harry began to follow him, but stopped when he heard a low snicker. He turned. Snape stood watching, arms crossed, looking cruelly amused. Harry wanted to throw something at him. You'd think you'd have a bit more sympathy. Why do you imagine that? Harry took in his cold, dark eyes, the nasty curve of his smirk. Something vicious sizzled inside him. Because you know what it's like to lose someone you love. It wasn't possible for Ghost to go white, but Snape gave a good impression of it. Buzzing with triumph and something much less pleasant, Harry turned his back and stormed out of the room. There was an edge of familiarity to what he was feeling, and he hated it. Dislike and fascination. The discomfort of not knowing how he was supposed to feel. The buildup of nearly 7 years of reasons to hate someone wasn't easily budged. And even if there'd been more to his story than Harry realized, Snape, Draco, either one, that didn't erase Harry's memories of being mocked and humiliated, of seeing pleasure in the eyes of someone trying to hurt him. Ron must have gone to find Hermione and Hufflepuff because he wasn't in the Slytherin common room. Malfoy, on the other hand, was. Alone. Harry stopped short, still feverish from his confrontation with Snape, still shivering with heat and anger. Malfoy raised his elbow in a self-protective gesture when he spotted Harry and took a step back. Harry thought he'd like to take his frustrations out on Malfoy in the usual way, but Malfoy just stared at him, refusing to rise to the occasion. Malfoy wore a traveling cloak. His trunk floated behind him, bobbing gently up and down. Why have you got your trunk out? Harry asked. Malfoy had the air of someone who'd been caught. He watched Harry carefully, his wand extended in levitation. Harry shoved his hands into his pockets to suppress the urge to pull his own. You need to take them on walks once a week or they get tetchy, said Malfoy. You do? Harry'd never once taken his trunk out for it. Of course not, you absolute idiot. Why do you think I've got it out? I'm going home. Harry blinked, startled. For a visit? For good, he sniffed. I've done my bit. Now it's time I get on with my life. But you're mine, Harry thought. You can't leave. Cold swept across his face. The reflexive thoughts swelled bright in his mind, taunting him. He clutched his chest in panic. You look like a goldfish with your mouth opening and closing like that, said Malfoy. He and his trunk swept past Harry towards the door. Harry dithered a moment, then followed him out into the dungeon corridor. You finished the mirrors? Someone else can take up where I've left off. That's not very responsible. My deepest fears have been realized. Harry Potter thinks I'm irresponsible. He walked faster. Stop following me. He swung his trunk across the corridor, making Harry jump back to avoid being hit. Are you leaving because of me? Asked Harry, approaching desperation. Of course I am, Potter. Everything's about you. They reached the staircase and began to climb. It was the sex, Harry told himself. He couldn't lose the sex. He'd die. He was sure of it. Apparently that wasn't the case for Malfoy, he realized, and something sharp sliced through his center. Malfoy hurried ahead of him with his stupid Ponzi posture and fancy black leather traveling trunk with his name on it in silver lettering. Harry kicked it, making it shoot forwards and knock Malfoy in the back of his legs. Malfoy staggered, then looked back at Harry, furious. Harry didn't know what to say. I don't want you to go. He wouldn't say it. Instead, he glared, feeling childish and stupid. Malfoy shook his head and continued up the stairs and out into the entrance hall. Find someone else to jerk you off. It won't take long. But I want you. Other than the two of them, the hall was empty. Harry ran to catch up with Malfoy and grabbed his arm. Malfoy whirled to face him, the trunk smacked to the floor. Malfoy thrust his wand against Harry's throat. Harry raised his chin, but didn't flinch. He gripped Malfoy harder, staring him down. It must make you sick, said Malfoy. Harry braced himself for Malfoy to say something awful. Malfoy went on, his voice low and knowing. You came back for me. You saved my life, but let so many better people die. Don't, said Harry. He could feel the pulse in Malfoy's forearm beating against his fingers. Do you deny it? Of course I fucking deny it. I've told you so. Licking his lips, Malfoy said, Do you reckon Weasley really forgives you for letting his brother die? Harry's fist was halfway to Malfoy's face before he even knew he was moving, but he managed to pull it back. Resisting pained him. He wanted to punch Malfoy. He wanted to force him down and beat the hell out of him. Harry Potter, said Malfoy. Harry fucking Potter. All my bloody life you've been there ruining things, fucking everything up. Harry bristled so hard it burned. You were the one always coming after me, Malfoy shouted in Harry's face. You decided you were too good for me the first moment we met. You insulted my only friend. You called him a savage. He is a savage. Harry leapt at him and they grappled. Malfoy's wand clattered to the floor. Malfoy laughed, somewhat hysterically, as Harry tried to pin his arms behind his back. He swiveled free and grabbed a handful of Harry's hair. Harry resisted the urge to submit. He jerked his head, but couldn't get loose. They both panted, bodies twisted together. It's just so easy to get to you, Potter, said Malfoy. Insult your friends, talk about the war, the slightest prod and you explode. So that's what it's all about, said Harry. You trying to get a reaction from me? Malfoy bared his teeth. Harry shuddered. They held each other tight enough that he could feel Malfoy's heart pounding, take in every detail of his face. The glittering fury in his gray eyes, the color flooding his cheeks, the sharpness of his jaw, the fall of his hair over his forehead, the soft curve of his lips. Harry drew tight against the barrier between them, the line he hadn't yet crossed, that he'd never intended to cross. Malfoy, bright and brittle, pulled at him, a siren song, saying this or nothing. Harry could shove him away. If he didn't, he'd risk crashing, and crashing hard. His fingers curved over the back of Malfoy's neck, as if they already knew Harry's decision. He held on tight and gave in, heart thumping with fear and the thrill of ignoring it. He wanted Malfoy. He'd have him. Fuck the risk. He yanked Malfoy closer and kissed him. A tremor ran through Malfoy's body. He made a sound like a sob. Then he grabbed Harry's shoulders and kissed him back. Harry moaned, something breaking loose and running rampant. He fell into the searing pressure of Malfoy's lips, hot and hard against his own. One kiss after another, he thrummed with intoxicating, electric pleasure. Malfoy stuttered curse words, the details lost between kisses. They clawed at each other, stumbling. Harry needed to get Malfoy somewhere private. He wanted to eat him, to devour him entirely. He shoved his hand between the fastenings of Malfoy's robes, snapping them off, and fisted a handful of his shirt. There was a broom cupboard, he remembered. He staggered, dragging Malfoy towards it. Boy! A woman's voice, fierce and commanding, echoed through the entrance hall. Both Harry and Malfoy froze, still breathing hard. Could you cut the shenanigans for a moment? Said Jimenez. They disentangled and leapt away from each other. Jimenez held the door open for two Aurors who supported a bedraggled, limping figure between them. We've got a situation here. It was Theo, gaunt, with filthy, matted hair, covered with scrapes and bruises. Alive! Relief hit Harry so hard it made his head spin. Malfoy shot across the floor towards his friend. Hey, said Jimenez, blocking his path. Careful now, he's injured. Malfoy ducked around her. Theo, who looked as if he'd crumple to the floor if the Aurors let go of him, gave Malfoy a wry smile. Hello, Draco. Draco made a strangled sound, then grabbed and hugged him. Theo collapsed against him, wincing. Jimenez wrenched Malfoy away. "What did I just tell you?" "I'm okay. I can stand on my own," said Theo. Are you all right?" said Malfoy. I thought... You wrote me off, didn't you? Thought I'd be spider meat by now." Malfoy stood there, trembling a moment. Then he straightened and turned to Jimenez. "Why are you just standing there, woman? This man needs a healer." "Get Chung," said Jimenez. One of the Aurors took on a look of concentration, then cast a Patronus, a long, scaly creature Harry thought was probably an alligator. It sailed out the front door. Harry ran over, not turned to look at him. He blinked, his lips parted. Harry scanned him, trying to judge how seriously he'd been hurt. "You escaped," he said. He smiled, wild with relief. "How do you do it?" Nott didn't answer. He stared at Harry with increasing intensity, frowning. His shoulders twitched. "Where's that healer?" said Malfoy. Nott groaned and started to shake. Alarmed, Jimenez pushed Malfoy out of the way and gently lowered Nott to the floor. "Potter," said Nott. "You should get out of here, Potter." He rolled onto a side and curled into a ball. A dark-haired Auror ran through the door and knelt beside him. She drew her wand and started casting spells. Harry stared at Malfoy. Malfoy kept his eyes on Nott. "He's dehydrated and starved," said Auror Chung. "There's a decent amount of spell damage. We'll take him to the hospital wing. Someone should owl St. Mungo's, see if they can send someone. Do we know if Poppy Pomfrey is available?" A stretcher was conjured. Nott settled on it. They levitated him towards the grand staircase. Malfoy went with them, hovering at Nott's side. They began to climb. "Malfoy!" said Harry. Malfoy stopped, looked back, face impassive. Harry shifted on his feet. "I'll bring your trunk back to your room." He waited, digging his fingernails into his palms. He hadn't come down from the kissing yet. It pounded through his blood, hot and joyful. He grinned. Malfoy took hold of the banister and squeezed it. He paused there, his eyes closed. He shook his head. "Yeah?" said Harry. "I'll do that, right?" Malfoy nodded. Harry's grin brightened. Malfoy took a moment, but then, with a resigned helplessness that made Harry's heart beat even faster, Malfoy smiled back.